Welcome back to U.S. history. We're at big letter C, remember Pearl Harbor. Because up to this point now, the U.S. has managed to remain neutral, although they are definitely tiptoeing the line of neutrality by supporting the Allies. Japan had continued to gain more control in Asia. It had decimated the Chinese army and then gained possession of Southeast Asia. The U.S. placed an oil embargo on Japan and froze all Japanese assets in the U.S. Douglas MacArthur, he was placed in command of all American forces in the Pacific in case war broke out. Number 1, Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, on a very testable date, a date that would live in infamy, Japanese surprise attack at Pearl Harbor brought the U.S. into World War II. Early on Sunday morning of the 7th, Japanese warplanes surprise attacked the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Japanese sank 3 battleships, seriously damaged 16 others, destroyed about 150 aircraft, and killed about 2,400 and injured about 1,200 men. Shortly thereafter, the Japanese continued their offensive by taking other British and American bases in the Pacific. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the U.S. aircraft carriers had been out of port and would prove to be more decisive in the war than the battleships, and the incident had finally united America to join in the war. There's a quote associated with this, "A day that will live in infamy," spoken by FDR himself. He demanded a declaration of war. Congress approved. At the same time, Britain declared war on Japan, and China declared war on the Axis powers. Germany and Italy declared war on China and the U.S. The war had really become a world war. If you look in your box on page 502, the pink box titled Damages at Pearl Harbor, it can show you the actual number of losses that came from this war. U.S. losses as well as some Japanese losses from the war. Number 2, Pearl Harbor was not the only U.S. target at this time. The fall of the Philippines. Remember, the Philippines belonged to the U.S. since the Spanish-American War of 1898. The Japanese war effort continued to advance as it invaded the U.S. territory of the Philippines. As the Japanese marched across the islands against stiff resistance, FDR ordered MacArthur to leave the islands before getting captured. MacArthur promised, as you see in this quote, "I shall return." Unfortunately for some of MacArthur's men, they were not able to escape. When the remaining U.S. forces surrendered, they were forced to make a brutal 80-mile death march to prison camps. Those who fell behind were killed. The conquest of the Philippines was now complete. Number 3. After suffering the defeats at Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, the U.S. needed a win, and they needed it badly. The solution? A long-range bombing raid on Japan itself. It was known as the Doolittle Raid. The solution to the dilemma was modifying the B-25, a medium bomber that was compact enough to take off at sea. After intense special training, volunteer crews under Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle set out with 16 B-25 bombers from the United States aboard the carrier U.S. Hornet, which joined Task Force 16 at sea under the command of Vice Admiral Bull Halsey. The original plan was for the B-25s to take off when the task force was 400 miles off Japan's coast, but the force was spotted by a Japanese fishing ship, which an American warship promptly sank. The possibility that the fishermen had radioed a warning of the task force to Japan required takeoffs at 625 miles instead. The raid was successful in bombing Tokyo and 3 other Japanese cities, but bad weather and other circumstances foiled the landings on the Chinese mainland that the American raiders had planned. 11 crews had to parachute out, and 4 crash landed. Of the 80 men involved in the raid, 3 men were killed and 8 were captured by the Japanese. 4 of those died in captivity. One plane landed in the Soviet Union, where the crew was imprisoned for 13 months. Although the raid did little damage to the factories, military installations, and oil storage facilities that the Americans hit, it encouraged Americans and surprised the Japanese, who were bewildered as to where the planes had originated. They knew that American forces were within striking range, which forced the Japanese to keep some military personnel and equipment on the home islands. Number 4. The Battle of Midway. By May of 1942, Japanese power had climaxed. A naval battle in the Coral Sea near Australia stopped a Japanese advance southward, and the Battle of Midway would stop the Japanese eastward. With the help of being able to break the Japanese radio codes, the U.S. intercepted messages and anticipated Japanese movement. The Battle of Midway proved to be the turning point battle in the Pacific. On this map that you see located right here, you see Hawaii, there's Alaska, here's Japan. Midway is located right here, midway between the U.S. and Japan. So first thing you need to know about the Battle of Midway, it was the turning point battle in the Pacific. The man placed in charge of the Battle of Midway was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. He was the commander of the U.S. fleet. The U.S. destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and the victory would be the first of many as the U.S. would slowly make its way to Tokyo for the final victory. So the U.S. won the battle. In your books on page 504, I want you to read about, in the tan box, the box about minority groups in World War II. They include the groups of the Nisei, the Navajo, and African Americans who all participated in this war. Once you have finished reading, please unpause and we'll resume. Letter D, home front. This is a map of the world. I just wanted to show it to you guys right now, even though we're talking about what's happening in the U.S. This shows us a visual as to how powerful the Axis powers had gotten by 1942. See, of course, Hitler and Mussolini having taken control of most of Europe and parts of Africa, and then the Japanese having taken over parts of China and most of Southeast Asia during this time period. World War II helped catapult America out of the Great Depression, unlike the New Deal programs. The economic output of the U.S. helped sustain the Allies. The factory was just as important as the soldier at this critical time of the war. Number 1, mobilizing the economy. The War Production Board. Thing you need to know about the WPB is it made peacetime businesses into wartime businesses. Automakers stopped making cars and started making tanks. Clothing manufacturers turned out uniforms, blankets, and parachutes. I mean, if we want to get a comparison, think of what's going on today with the coronavirus situation. A lot of the peacetime industries that we have today are now out there trying to build things that will help us in this war effort, whether that has to do with face masks to protect individual people, whether that has to do with machines that will help keep patients alive when they are brought to the hospital. And so, yes, we've always seen the U.S. shift gears into producing for a dramatic issue going on at the time, whether today it's dealing with the virus or whether back in World War II dealing with the actual war going on. Another thing that Americans were doing, they were rationing. The war effort required a system of nationwide rationing. Today, we try to make sure, stores tell us to ration toilet paper and hand sanitizer and soap. Make sure you don't buy more than 1 or 2 containers to help you out. Well, back in the war, they were dealing with things like food and supplies. Every person was issued a ration book containing stamps needed to purchase various goods like meat, sugar, or even shoes. New victory gardens were planted to help the war effort, and by 1943, Americans were growing 1/3 of the U.S.'s total vegetables at home. Motorists were given a certain amount of gasoline to be used each month. Several states established a victory speed of 35 miles per hour in order to conserve necessary fuel. Recycling became popular as Boy Scouts and others recycled old metal and rubber bits to do their part to help, as they said, scrap the Axis. Number 2, manpower and woman power. 15 million men and women served in the military. Most of these were men, and the women were generally put into non-combatant roles, but they still participated. Also, we see an increase of women in the workforce. With many men going off to fight, more women joined the workforce. By 1944, about 36% of the workforce consisted of women. Many women took jobs that had traditionally been, quote-unquote, men jobs. Rosie the Riveter is probably the best example of women joining the workforce during this time. Unfortunately, with more women in the workforce, it further strained family life and child care. Number 3, Axis taxes. It almost rhymes. The U.S. income tax went up during World War II. In order to pay for the war effort and to avoid going further into debt, the U.S. increased taxes that made more Americans taxpayers. For example, in 1939, about 5% of the workforce paid income taxes. In 1945, by the end of the war, 90% did. So U.S. income taxes went up, not just in how much they paid, but the fact that more people had to pay it. Also, and sadly, there was a tax on the family of soldiers. With the mobilization of millions of men, nearly every family had a very personal interest in the news from the war front. Blue Star banners proudly hung in windows across America, representing a son or husband gone off to war. Gold Star mothers replaced the blue banner in memory of a fallen son who would not be coming home. The war required of millions of Americans their courage, patriotism, sacrifice, and sometimes their grief. That's all the notes that we're going to cover for today. You guys have a quiz. It's page 499 to 507. It should be located in your packet. Please make sure you do the quiz and turn it in with your week 4 packet. Hope you all have a good rest of the day. Be good, do good. Bye.